The reading I've chosen this morning is from John's Gospel, chapter 10. It's the story of the Good Shepherd. But in order to kind of, before I begin, I need to tell you about a funny anecdote that happened to me one time in Kenya, and I was trying to master a language called Nandi. And unfortunately, in order to tell you exactly what I said, I need to use one rude word in the story. But here's what happened. I went to Kenya in 1972. I'd learned Swahili really well. And now, 1975, I was learning a Kalenjin language called Nandi. So I spent 3 months living in a Nandi village learning the language. And so at one stage, I felt like I knew the language well enough to attempt a homily in Nandi. And I chose this passage from John's Gospel. And so I started off, I wanted to say, today is the feast of Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd. And in Nandi, what I said was, Raini ko betuno o na Yesu Christo mestawa nemye. Now, nemye in Nandi can mean good or big or great. But I mixed up a word. Mestawat is a shepherd, but mestawet is an anus. And so I instead of saying Raini ko betuno na Yesu Christo mestawa nemye, what I said was mestawe nemye. And the whole congregation is hilarious because what I actually said was, today is the feast of Jesus Christ, the great asshole. So I hope I'm not going to repeat that mistake today. So here's the reading in English, a language I learned fairly recently. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for my sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them along also. They too will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Words inspired by God. Nikolai Kardashev was a very famous Russian astrophysicist who was fascinated at the idea that there may be other civilizations in the cosmos. In fact, many, many different kinds of civilizations. So he created a very famous typology of such civilizations. And he believed that there might be 3 different categories of civilizations. Now, since then, I actually believe there are actually 5 different categories, but his 3 categories was as follows. What he called a type 1 civilization, he believed, was a civilization that could utilize all its planetary resources ecologically in order to kind of create energy for whatever they needed. And so in the case of planet Earth, it might be something like, not only can we utilize the energy of the sun, but of the wind and the waves, of volcanoes, of tsunamis, of earthquakes, various kinds, that we could harvest all those energies. So there would be an eternal supply of those. A type 2 civilization, he believed, was a civilization that could do that not just for their planetary system, but for their entire solar system. Whatever, sun they were part of and whatever planets revolved about that sun, that they could harness the energies from all those different planets. So if we were a type 2, we could be harvesting not just sunlight and stuff on Earth, we could harvest, for instance, the energies of Mercury, of Venus, of Mars, of Jupiter, of Saturn, of Uranus, of Pluto, Neptune. We could harvest all of those if we were a type 2. A type 3 civilization, he believed, was one that could literally harvest the energies of the entire galaxy. In our case, would be the Milky Way galaxy. Now, I posit that there may be 2 other civilizations even beyond that. One which would be able to harvest literally cosmic energy in all its forms. And the 5th one would be if we believe in a multi-cosmic universe, that we live in a bubble bath of cosmoses, that if a type 5 may be able to harvest all of those, they'd be indistinguishable from God. Now, he was asked at one stage, into which category does planet Earth and human civilization fall? He said, we're type 0. We haven't yet reached type 1. And he went on to say that the most difficult transition actually is going from a type 0 to a type 1. Because during that transition, people are going to develop technologies capable of utterly destroying themselves and their planetary system. And so a typology of civilization is a very important cosmic factor. Now, I believe, and what I want to talk about for this month, as you know, I take a topic each month, I develop it for 2 Sundays, then on the 3rd Sunday, I do a recap and open up to Q&A. So the theme I've chosen for July, God willing, I want to talk about a typology of incarnational mission. How many different kinds of ways are there of responding to the fact that we're incarnated, bite-sized pieces of God who have a specific mission? And so today I'm going to focus on 2 aspects of that. I'm going to talk about the concept of incarnation itself. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about evolution, within the incarnational cycle. So I've said to you on a previous occasion that I believe that the cosmos is a theme park created by God so that beings may experience various kinds of rides. And I believe actually that planet Earth is one of the scariest rides in the cosmos. Only very courageous souls sign up for rides on planet Earth. Now, as human beings, we have volunteered to incarnate on a planet which is subject to hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, subject to animal predation, to poisonous plants, and we're locked in these spacesuits, these bodies which are subject to injury and illness and ultimately death. And we do that, we volunteer to inhabit a spacesuit which has 4 significant limitations. And the first limitation is the limitation of space. In other words, we who are cosmic beings have agreed to incarnate in these tiny little spacesuits, in this case, 150 pounds of it. So we go from cosmic size down to this tiny little physical body of ours. The second limitation is that we're operating and trying to understand incarnation with this tiny little laptop that we carry between our ears, this little 3-pound mass that we call the brain. So there's a huge reduction. We who are of cosmic intelligence are now operating from this tiny little laptop. The third limitation is that we're subject to the illusion of time. This little laptop is so inadequate to grokking the entirety of our experiences that we have to break up our experiences into bite-sized pieces and then process them chronologically, giving rise to the illusion of time. That's the third limitation. And then the most deadly one of all, the fourth limitation, is we have amnesia. As soon as we're born, as we exit the womb, we have amnesia for the Akashic records. We who are privy to all of the experiences all creatures through all of time have had, we're cut off from that. And so we're not mindful beings anymore. So we have these 4 extraordinary limitations. And in that sense, then, we've signed up for possibly one of the scariest rides in the cosmos. And the purpose obviously is to grow. So what are the objectives? Why would we agree? And why would God allow such a kind of an arrangement? Now, I think there are two beneficiaries. God is a beneficiary, and we are beneficiaries. So how does God benefit? If God is all there is, if there is nothing except God, then God cannot have experiences. God cannot generate because there's nothing except self to relate to. So God can't have experiences. And so God does this extraordinary trick, sleight of hand, by a kind of a self-fracturing, what modern spirituality would call netzotzim, in Hebrew netzotzim, sparks of the divine. The God self-fractures. We're like bees in a beehive going out gathering pollen and nectars and stories and bringing back to the hive. So we are the way, our creatures are the way in which God generates experiences. So that's the first beneficiary. And the second beneficiary is that the individual souls, they get to experience and therefore to transcend the illusion of separation and the illusion of identification with the spacesuit. We get the opportunity, while we're still encapsulated, to transcend being merely skin-encapsulated egos and realize that we're a spark of the divine. So we are the second beneficiary. Now, in order to kind of process all that information, we have this little human brain. So very, very often you hear the question, does consciousness survive death? Is there life after death? I think there's a much more important question to ask, and that is, how much consciousness survives birth? Because consciousness doesn't really survive birth, only a tiny sliver of it. Because the brain is not the source of consciousness. The brain has two functions, basically. Firstly, it is a transmitter and receiver of previously existing cosmic consciousness, in the same way in which your television set, doesn't create the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra playing, Bach in Germany. All your TV does, it's an electromagnetic transducer that allows you audio and visual access to an event which is happening elsewhere. So the brain is literally a transmitter and a receiver of a pre-existing cosmic consciousness. And moreover, it is a radical filter and reducer of that consciousness, because this little laptop cannot contain all that information. There's actually a part of the hindbrain right here at the brainstem, which is called the reticular activating system, the RAS for short. And its function is to act as a kind of a secretary or a front desk to make sure that all of our experiences do not reach the boss, which is the executive function of the neocortex. So the secretary makes the decision who gets to see the boss, because the boss is very, very busy. You can't just have anybody have access to the boss anytime they want. And so all of our sensory input, is filtered, reduced, at this RAS, the reticular activating system, and the hindbrain. Only certain stuff is allowed to get through. Now, what happens sometimes is, so if somebody, for instance, with a brain injury, a significant brain injury, or somebody who was struck by lightning, or somebody who has autism, some of those conditions sometimes will partially disable the brain's filtering system and allow a lot more information to enter awareness. And then you get, these kind of autistic savants who are geniuses at math or music or art, or computation of various kinds. And so we have to understand that what is consciousness. And in a dream a few months ago, I asked that question. I seeded my dream. And the answer I got was that consciousness is source-saturated self-awareness. And that source-saturated self-awareness is another name for God, if you like. And we have partial access to that, but our very brains that give us access to it also filter and reduce our ability to connect with it. So in some senses, that's the story of incarnation. So now we're here. What's next? So now we begin the process of evolution. There's a notion in evolution called convergent evolution, and convergent evolution is the principle that given the same genetic code, you'll have similar creatures developing in similar environments. So you bring the same genetic code into different areas. If they have the same basic environments, the same creatures are going to evolve as a result of the interplay between the genetic code and the environment in which it finds itself. And obviously the opposite is also true. If you get the same genetic code in different environments, you'll get different creatures evolving. So the same DNA, which gives us the kinds of life we have on planet Earth, if that DNA were to land elsewhere in a different galaxy, it would create totally different kinds of creatures or totally different kinds of beings. Now, I believe that the deepest code of all, much, much greater than DNA, is the Logos, the Word of God. And so this Word of God, can manifest in all kinds of dimensions, all the ways from physical dimensions to the angelic realms. So wherever this code lands, it's going to create radically different kinds of creatures, depending on the dimensions and the environments in which it finds itself. So there's an evolutionary trajectory. And then each shift, as we move in this evolutionary trajectory, each shift creates both greater possibilities and also greater temptations. Because the brighter we are, the more evolved we are, the greater the temptations are to exercise that power selfishly. And so we have to learn, what this evolutionary process involves. And I believe that, there are three great drives, that are behind this evolutionary trajectory. And so we're changing gears constantly. And those great three shifts, in my opinion, are, and they can create either a brilliant combination or a deadly combination. And the three great shifts are, the first one is self-awareness. And you find different levels of self-awareness among plants, animals, humans, and beyond. Plants obviously have self-awareness, they're able to orient towards the sun. Animals have self-awareness, they're able to protect themselves and escape from predators. Humans obviously have some level of self-awareness. So the first great driver of evolution, I believe, is self-awareness. The second great driver, I believe, is free will, the power to make personal choices. And then the third great driver is technology. And so I want you to imagine for a moment, whatever room you're sitting in right now, if it's a typical kind of rectangular room or a square room, there are three axes to it. So there's, for instance, the length of the room, let's call that the x-axis. And then there's the width of the room, let's call that the y-axis. And then there's the height of the room, let's call that the z-axis. And so with those three axes, mathematically speaking, you can locate any item anywhere within the room, whether it's something on the floor or it's a butterfly flying across the space. With those three axes, you can precisely locate the position of anything in the room. Now, I think the same thing is true of the enlightenment process. There are three axes as well in this enlightenment process. So the x-axis then for me would be self-awareness. The y-axis would be free will, and the z-axis would be technology. And there's an infinite range along each axis. There's an infinite range, and so there's an infinite combination of all three. Every single creature then, and every single community, occupies a unique position in that triad. But that unique position can change depending on environmental circumstance. It can go on any axis, it go in one of two directions. It can move towards love and light and freedom, or it can move towards fear and dark and prison, a habit prison. I use just examples here and just make these up. And when I talk about, advanced and retarded, I'm talking about individual souls, and I'm also talking about communities of various kinds, whether they're tribal communities, national communities, or a global community. So what would an advanced person or an advanced community look like? Firstly, self-awareness would be awareness of the soul self. That person or that group would be identified with the soul self, not the role self, not the characters playing in a particular incarnation, but its soul self. So the self-awareness would be an identification with the soul. Freedom, free will would morph into freedom. And there's a huge difference between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God, because the only truly free person is the one who constantly chooses the good. And so an advanced person or system will move from free will into freedom. And thirdly, on the technological axis, an advanced group or an advanced person will use technology ecologically with love and compassion for all creatures. So that's what it would look like for an advanced individual or a community. What would a retarded person, I'm using retarded in the sense of soul evolution, what would a retarded person or a retarded community look like? In that instance, self-awareness would be limited to the notion of a separate ego. I'm only aware of myself as this isolated, skin-encapsulated person. What would free will look like? It would be located completely at the service to self end of the spectrum. It would be based on greed and on fear, and it would never move into freedom. And what would its technology look like? It would be the technology of destruction. It would be weapons of mass destruction. It would be agribusiness instead of agriculture. It would be pharmaceutical industries. It would be the state surveillance system. That's what retarded looks like when technology is used by people who are exercising free will for selfish agendas. And so if you think, for instance, about extraterrestrials, extra-dimensionals, or angelic beings, because they're much further along in all these three on this triad, they have greater powers and they have greater temptations. And so archetypally, you get the notion of the fallen angels in a battle with Archangel Michael. You'll get the notion of extraterrestrials who intervene in human affairs across an entire spectrum, those who are hoping that we'll move and develop, and those who are using us as a kind of a prison camp. And therefore, Jesus will say famously, of those who have, more will be expected. That was his famous parable of the talents. If you decide to send some photographs to a family member, you've been on vacation somewhere and you're sending photographs back home. As you send it through your computer, the computer employs two kinds of codes to deliver your photographs. The first one is called a transmission code, and it sends the photographs pixel by pixel, which will be kind of downloaded at the other side. But there's a second code also built in. It's called an error correction code. Because you're sending stuff to the computer, some of the packets get lost or they get kind of disfigured in some way. So there's a second code that follows the first to try to reconstruct the original and fill in the missing pieces. Now, the interesting thing is when you study, for instance, quantum mechanics or particularly string theory, what they find out, deposit in string theory, that there are error correction codes built into string theory, that whoever created the entire cosmos actually built error correction codes into the very design of the cosmos, which tells us straight out there is a cosmic designer. You call it God, call it whatever you will. So where is God in this equation? God is the cosmic designer who not only gave the transmissions codes that allowed the universe to come into being, but the error correction codes that allow us to see as is if we have the courage to move there. It's the notion of biocentrism, where life, gives birth to matter. Matter does not give birth to life. The whole notion of biocentrism. Which brings me to my final point then. I want to talk about this notion of what biologically is called apoptosis. And apoptosis is a system of cellular death and rebirth. And it is vitally important. It happens embryologically, it happens biologically, and I would say it happens sociologically, and it also happens spiritually. So what does embryological apoptosis look like? When you were in your mother's womb, at some stage, you actually had webbed feet and webbed fingers, because part of our trajectory was we were marine creatures at some stage. So in the course of being in the womb, those webs disintegrate through apoptosis. Those cells die off because they're not going to be necessary for a landlubber's life. And so you had a tail at some stage, and now you're born with a vestigial coccyx. You were a marine animal at some stage, swimming in the amniotic fluid. You're not going to need that after birth. And so apoptosis embryologically is, preparing the little embryo for life on dry land. So it becomes really important. Once we're born, apoptosis continues. And so, for instance, we have to constantly replace the cells of our bodies. Every single month, you're going to replace every single skin cell in your body. In fact, 50% of the dust in your home is dead skin cells. So we have to constantly shed our skin and replace it with brand new cells. The stomach lining replaces itself on a 6-week cycle. Within every 6 weeks, you shed every single cell in your stomach lining and replace it with brand new cells. Your entire skeleton replaces its cellular self on a 6-month cycle, and your entire body replaces itself on a 7-year cycle. Without that, that's vital for health. You have to die. You have to die and be reborn on a regular basis in order to survive and to have any form of longevity. Now, I'm going to suggest that it's not just true embryologically and not just true biologically. It is very true as well sociologically. You have this old kind of adage in ancient times when the monarch had died and the chant was, "The king is dead, long live the king. The king is dead, long live the king." The old order had to pass away in order for a new order to be born. And if any period of human history needed very definitely for the old king to die and give birth to a new system, it is the times in which we live. Because the old king at the moment is tyranny in all its forms, whether they're royal bloodlines or theocracies or communist regimes or billionaire technocrats or political dynasties. They have to change and die and give way to the recognition of the inner divinity of every single one of us. So there's an extraordinary dance, a sociological dance between true evolution and the power grab of a cancerous cabal. People like the World Economic Forum, WHO, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund. These extraordinary tyrannical systems need to die off and be replaced with real human beings creating systems which are based on the inner divinity of every single one of us. And therefore then that leads to what I'm going to call a spiritual apoptosis. The necessary religious shift from the notion of individual saved people or individual chosen races or extra ecclesiam nulla est salus, the Catholic teaching, outside the Catholic Church, there is no redemption, or born again Christians. That has to give way to the recognition of our Buddha nature and of Christ consciousness. So cancer is when cells refuse to die and be replaced. That is ultimately what biological cancer is. It is cells refusing to die and be replaced. But I believe that this happens physically, sociologically, and spiritually. So there's the extraordinary dance, the dance of complexity, the balance between increased complexity as individual cells come together in families, creating organs, and the organs come together and create an organism, like a human being with a heart and a lung and a liver, etc. And these organisms, these individual organisms, people, they become members of an extended family. And the family becomes part of a tribe, and the tribe becomes part of a nation, and the nation becomes part of a global species. But at each stage, you have to fully honor the completeness of every single level of the system. When an organ comes together, it does not get rid of the individual cells. Every single cell in your body, and you have about 70 trillion of them, as you know, is completely independent in the sense that, it has a self-alienation system, it has a cardiovascular system, it has a neuronal system, every single cell. So it's independent in one sense, but they come together volitionally to create more complexity while honoring the individual components at every stage of the process. We are one. I said in an interview way back in 2003, an interview I gave, that there's only one human being on planet Earth. I call that human being Homo originalis. But we have specialized, just like you, as you sit at home, you came from a single zygote, a single cell that divided in 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc. And now you've got 70 trillion cells in your body. And every single one of them could recreate all of you if necessary. If you took a stem cell from you, you could recreate yourself. But certain cells have specialized. Some decided to become eye cells. Some decided to become saliva cells. Some decided to be heart cells. And in the very same way, there's only one human being, which is divided again and again and again into 8 billion members right now. And some of them have specialized. Some of them are Irish, some of them are Zambian, some of them are from Finland, some of them are male, some of them are female, some of them have genius IQs, and some people are retarded as part of the evolutionary and the reincarnational cycle. But in a sense, they're all one. You could recreate the entire human experiment from a single human being. And I'm not talking about an individual biological cell, I'm talking about the spirit that infuses the Earth safari. So ultimately, the function of life on planet Earth, the reason we're here, is to rebuild the body of God. That God who self-fractured in order to generate experiences and allow individual souls to experience appearance separation, the ultimate level of complexity is to realize that we are God and our job is to rebuild the body of God. Namaste, my friends.